$7.6 billion. Gone. And with it, the carefully constructed story that the entire auto industry has been selling you for the better part of a decade. General Motors didn't just lose money, they exposed a lie. And today, we're going to break down exactly what that lie was, who told it, who profited from it, and why the bill is now landing squarely on the shoulders of the American consumer. Stay with me, because this goes much deeper than one company's bad quarter. If you don't want to miss the latest car updates and hidden truths, hit subscribe now, because the next video might be the one everyone else knows, but you don't. Let's go back to the beginning, because context matters here.
For years, and I mean years, a very specific story was being told to the American public. It went something like this: the gasoline engine is finished, the electric vehicle is inevitable, the transition is already happening, and if you're not on board, you're standing in the way of progress. That was the narrative. Clean, simple, and repeated so often across boardrooms, government briefings, and mainstream media that it started to feel like settled fact rather than a sales pitch. Now, here's the thing about a good lie. It doesn't have to be entirely false to be deeply misleading. Electric vehicles are real. The technology works. Nobody serious is arguing otherwise. But the lie wasn't about whether EVs could exist. The lie was about the timeline, the demand, and most importantly, who was actually driving this transformation. Consumers choosing freely in the marketplace, or regulators, subsidies, and mandates manufacturing the appearance of demand that was never quite there on its own. And now, in 2025, with General Motors sitting on $7.6 billion in EV-related losses, that distinction is impossible to ignore any longer. This isn't a story about EVs failing. This is a story about what happens when an industry builds a future around political will instead of consumer reality, yes, and then the political winds shift. Let's talk about the announcement itself, because the way it was delivered tells you almost as much as the numbers do. General Motors did not hold a press conference. There was no bold rebranding moment, no executives standing at a podium reframing the narrative with optimistic language. Instead, the news came out the way uncomfortable corporate truths usually do. Quietly, buried in financial disclosures, worded carefully enough to avoid triggering headlines, but significant enough that anyone paying attention had to stop and take notice. The company has indefinitely delayed the next generation refresh of its electric truck and SUV lineup, not postponed to a specific future date, not paused pending review, indefinitely delayed, which in corporate language means we don't have a plan we're confident enough to commit to publicly, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. There's no new target date. There's no revised roadmap with bold projections. What there is instead is a $7.6 billion loss figure tied directly to EV operations in 2025 alone, a number that includes write-downs from scrapped production plans and abandoned battery supply commitments. That's not a stumble, that's a structural reckoning. And then there's Factory Zero, GM's flagship electric vehicle production facility, once held up as the physical embodiment of America's electric future, a symbol of what commitment to the transition looked like in concrete and steel. That facility has experienced shutdowns. The workforce has been cut, production volumes for its highest profile electric models have been consistently disappointing. The factory that was supposed to represent the future is instead becoming a case study in what happens when ambition outruns demand. Let that sink in. The flagship, shutdowns, workforce cuts, underwhelming volumes. This wasn't a side project. This was the main event, and it isn't delivering. Now, here's where we get to one of the most revealing data points in this entire story, and it's one that the people who push this agenda hardest really don't want you to focus on. EV sales dropped 43% in the fourth quarter. The moment government incentives dried up, 43% in a single quarter, the moment the financial support pulled back. Think about what that number actually means. If electric vehicles were winning on their genuine merits, on performance, on value, on convenience, on the total ownership experience, then removing a tax incentive might cause some softness in the market. That's normal. Every industry sees some demand elasticity around subsidies. But a 43% collapse isn't elasticity, that's dependency. That's a market that wasn't organically generating that level of demand to begin with. What the subsidy was really doing, and this is the uncomfortable truth that was never part of the official talking points, was masking the gap between where consumer demand actually was and where the industry needed it to be to justify the billions being poured into the transition. The incentive wasn't accelerating a trend. In far too many cases, it was creating the illusion of one, and now the illusion is gone. The inventory is sitting on lots. The sales numbers have cratered, and the automakers who bet everything on a government-supported acceleration of this timeline are left holding losses prices that run into the billions. Meanwhile, something quietly telling is happening on the other side of the lot. While electric trucks accumulate unsold inventory, GM is doubling down on gas-powered trucks, the Silverado, the Sierra. The vehicles that Washington loves to demonize in policy speeches and that environmental advocates treat as the enemy. Those trucks are selling strongly. They're not just keeping the lights on at GM, they are GM's financial foundation right now. The product that funds the salaries, the facilities, the research, and yes, even whatever remains of the electric vehicle program. The vehicles politicians most want to eliminate are the ones making it possible for the company to survive long enough to pursue the future those same politicians are demanding. That's not irony, that's reality. Here's the part of this conversation that gets skipped over constantly in the mainstream coverage, and it drives me absolutely crazy because it's the most important part. Why didn't consumers follow? It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't resistance to change for its own sake. American consumers are not anti-technology. They adopted smartphones faster than any previous consumer technology in history. They stream, they shop online, they upgrade their devices constantly. The idea that these same people are simply too stubborn or too backward to embrace electric vehicles fundamentally misunderstands what's actually happening. The gap isn't psychological, it's practical. Start with price. Electric trucks and SUVs still carry a significant premium over their gasoline counterparts. For working families, the people who actually buy trucks because they need trucks, not as a lifestyle statement, that price difference is not a minor inconvenience. It's a deal breaker, especially in an economic environment where every dollar is already stretched. Then there's range. Not range under ideal showroom conditions, not the number printed on the window sticker. Real world range. Because here's what happens when you load up a truck and start towing, exactly the job most truck buyers need their truck to do, that range figure drops significantly. And you're left doing complicated mental math about where you can stop, how long it will take, and whether you can make it to your destination and back without a 2-hour interruption to your day. Which brings us to charging infrastructure. Now, if you live in a major metropolitan area, close to well-maintained charging networks, with the ability to install a home charger in your garage, the infrastructure challenge is manageable. But a huge portion of American truck buyers don't live that life. They're in rural areas, in smaller cities, in regions where charging infrastructure is inconsistent, unreliable, or simply doesn't exist at the scale needed. And unlike a gasoline station, which is everywhere, takes 5 minutes, and sends you on your way with a full tank, a charging session is a commitment. We're talking anywhere from 30 minutes on a fast charger to several hours in less optimal conditions. That is a fundamentally different relationship with your vehicle, and for many people, it genuinely doesn't work with how they actually live their lives. And then there's insurance. EV insurance premiums run meaningfully higher than equivalent gas-powered vehicles, partly due to the cost of battery repairs and the specialized labor required. It's one more number that makes the total cost of EV ownership more complicated than the sticker price suggests. None of these are reasons why electric vehicles can never succeed. They're reasons why a government-mandated, subsidy-propped, politically accelerated timeline was always going to run into a wall, because the product, as it exists today for the people who need it most, hasn't closed the gap on the things that matter most in daily life. You can write all the regulations you want, you can set any mandate deadline you choose, but you cannot regulate away a 30-minute charge time. You cannot subsidize charging stations into existence overnight across rural America. You cannot mandate that working families absorb premium pricing they can't afford. Consumer behavior is driven by real-world experience, and the real-world experience wasn't matching the press release version of the electric future. GM's announcement didn't happen in a vacuum, and this is critical to understand because some people will look at these numbers and conclude this is a GM-specific management failure, a case of one company making bad bets. That framing is wrong. And it's conveniently wrong because it lets the architects of the broader policy agenda off the hook. What GM is experiencing is a concentrated version of a correction that is quietly rippling through the entire automotive industry. Automakers across the board have been walking back aggressive EV timelines, reducing production targets, shifting investment back toward hybrid technologies and internal combustion platforms, and in many cases acknowledging, usually without fanfare, that the schedules they publicly committed to were not grounded in realistic demand forecasts. Why did they make those commitments in the first place if they weren't realistic? Because they had to. The regulatory environment in multiple major markets was constructed in a way that gave automakers essentially two options: race toward electrification or face escalating compliance penalties and the threat of being locked out of key markets. So they raced. They made the announcements, they held the events, they unveiled the concepts and committed the capital. Not because the market was organically pulling them in that direction at that speed, but because the policy environment left them little choice. And for a while, With subsidies propping up demand numbers and early adopter enthusiasm generating positive headlines, the strategy held together. The narrative stayed clean. The story worked. But markets are relentless truth tellers. You can manipulate demand for a quarter, maybe for a few years with enough subsidy money. But eventually, the real signal breaks through. And the real signal is this. At current price points, with current infrastructure, in current market conditions, mass market electric vehicle adoption, particularly for trucks and larger vehicles, is not happening at the pace the policy mandates assumed. The consumers who are going to be there aren't there. The infrastructure that was going to be built isn't built, and the financial losses from bridging that gap are now too large to hide. This is a reckoning, not for electric vehicle technology itself. Again, the technology is real and improving. But for the specific theory that government mandates, regulatory pressure, and subsidy engineering could compress a generational consumer shift into a 5 to 10-year political window. That theory has now cost General Motors alone $7.6 billion in a single year. Across the industry, the total bill is staggering. So where does this actually go from here? Because that's the question that matters most, and it's the one with the most nuance. The electric vehicle transition is not canceled. Let's be completely clear about that. The technology continues to improve. Battery costs are trending downward over time. Charging infrastructure, while inadequate today, is expanding. And there absolutely is a meaningful segment of consumers, particularly in urban areas for shorter commute profiles for second vehicle use cases, where EVs make excellent practical sense right now. What is being canceled, or at least dramatically recalibrated, is the government-imposed fast track. The assumption that regulators could effectively override the normal pace of consumer-led market adoption. The belief that with enough mandates and enough subsidy money, you could force an industry to transform itself on a political timeline rather than a market timeline. What we're moving back toward, and what GM's announcement is a clear signal of, is a world where consumer demand drives the pace of this transition, where automakers invest in electric vehicles at the rate that consumers are actually willing to adopt them, rather than the rate that legislators have decreed, where the hybrid vehicle, which delivers meaningful efficiency gains while eliminating the infrastructure and range anxiety issues, is recognized as the practical bridge technology that many consumers actually want, rather than dismissed as an inadequate half measure. That's a healthier market. It's a slower transition than the mandate-driven version. But it's a real one, built on genuine demand rather than artificial support. And crucially, it's one where the consumer, not the regulator, is in the driver's seat. $7.6 billion is a lot of money to pay for a reality check, but that's what General Motors has effectively paid to have the fundamental assumptions behind the industry's electric transformation stress tested against the real world. And the real world delivered its verdict. Affordability beats ideology every single time. Infrastructure has to actually exist before you can build a mass market around it. Consumers will not pay a premium for a product that doesn't solve their real world problems better than the alternative they already have. And no amount of regulatory pressure, no subsidy structure, no mandate deadline can permanently override those basic truths. The biggest lie in the auto industry wasn't that electric vehicles don't work. They do. The biggest lie was that the timeline was inevitable, that consumer adoption was a given, that the transition was so locked in that anyone who questioned it was simply wrong. That lie cost billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, and years of misallocated investment. And now the industry is doing what it should have been allowed to do from the beginning, listening to the market, reading actual consumer demand, and building products and timelines around reality rather than political ambition. The electric future will come, but it's going to arrive on the consumer's schedule, not Washington's. And honestly, that's exactly how it should work.